Stephen Garrett placed the order on April 14, 2021. He was sitting in the sales office at Redstone Agricultural Equipment, a Massey Ferguson dealership outside of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The salesman's name was Brian, and he had the spec sheet laid out on the desk between them. A 2022 Massey Ferguson 8S.265, 265 horsepower, continuously variable transmission, full GPS package, LED lighting, premium suspension cab, factory warranty. The base price was $412,000. With the options Stephen wanted, the total came to $448,000. It was a lot of money, but Stephen had run the numbers, and in April 2021 the numbers made sense. Stephen was 46 years old. He farmed 1,200 acres of corn and soybeans in southeastern South Dakota. He had been farming since he was 23, took over the operation from his father, and had built it into a stable, profitable business. His current tractor was a 2011 Case IH Magnum 250. It had 7,400 hours on it, and it was starting to show its age. The transmission was slipping occasionally. The hydraulics were slower than they used to be. The cab was outdated. Stephen had been planning to replace it for 2 years, and the Massey Ferguson 8S265 was exactly what he wanted. More power, better fuel efficiency, modern technology. He had test-driven one at a farm show in March, and it had impressed him. The CVT was smooth, the cab was quiet, the controls were intuitive, it felt like the right machine, and in April 2021, he could afford it. Corn prices were strong, $73 per bushel. Soybean prices were pushing $16. Stephen's 2020 harvest had been excellent. He had cash in the bank. His operating loan was paid down. His debt-to-income ratio was solid. Brian ran the financing options. At current interest rates, Stephen could finance the tractor at 4.1% over 7 years. That would put his monthly payment at around $1,900. Stephen's accountant had told him he could comfortably handle up to $2,200 per month without stressing the operation. $1,900 was well within range. Stephen asked about delivery time. Brian checked the system. He said Massey Ferguson was quoting 9 to 12 months for new orders. Delivery would likely be somewhere between January and April 2022. Stephen said that worked. He would have the case paid off by then, and he could trade it in when the Massey Ferguson arrived. Brian printed the contract. Stephen read through it. Standard terms: $448,000, 10% deposit due at signing, balance due at delivery, financing contingent on approval, delivery estimated at 9 to 12 months. Stephen signed the contract. He wrote a check for $44,800. The deposit. Brian shook his hand and said he would stay in touch with updates. Stephen drove home feeling good. He had just ordered the tractor he had been planning for. Everything was on track. 3 months later, Brian called. It was July 2021. He said there was a delay. Massey Ferguson was experiencing supply chain issues, computer chips, wiring harnesses, hydraulic components. The global manufacturing network was backed up. The new delivery estimate was late 2022, possibly early 2023. Stephen asked if that was definite. Brian said no, it was an estimate. Things were changing week to week. Stephen said he understood. He had been hearing about supply chain problems on the news. Everyone was dealing with it. He told Brian to keep him updated. Brian said he would. Stephen hung up and didn't think much of it. A delay was inconvenient, but it wasn't a disaster. He would just run the Case IH for another year. It was still functional. He could make it work. 6 months later, in January 2022, Brian called again. Another delay. Massey Ferguson was now quoting mid to late 2023 for delivery. Stephen asked what was causing the continued delays. Brian said it was a combination of things: parts shortages, labor shortages at the factories, shipping container backlogs, COVID restrictions overseas. The entire agricultural equipment industry was backlogged. John Deere was delayed, Case was delayed, New Holland was delayed. Everyone was in the same situation. Stephen asked if he could cancel the order and get his deposit back. Brian said he could, but he would forfeit 20% of the deposit as a cancellation fee. That would cost Stephen almost $9,000, and if he canceled, he would be back at the end of the line if he wanted to order another tractor. Wait times for new orders were now pushing 2 years. Stephen thought about it. He decided to stay in. He had already put down $44,000. He didn't want to lose $9,000 of it, and he still wanted the tractor. He told Brian he would wait. Brian said he appreciated the patience. He said Massey Ferguson was doing everything they could to catch up. Stephen said he hoped so. Another 6 months passed. July 2022. No tractor, no call from Brian. Stephen called the dealership. Brian said the latest update from Massey Ferguson was early 2024. Stephen felt his stomach drop. Early 2024 was almost 3 years from the original order date. He asked if Brian was serious. Brian said he was. He said the delays were industry-wide and completely out of the dealership's control. Stephen asked if there was any way to expedite it. Brian said no. The orders were being filled in sequence. Stephen was in the queue. He would get his tractor when his number came up. Stephen asked again about canceling. Brian reminded him about the 20% penalty. Stephen said this was getting ridiculous. Brian said he agreed, but there was nothing he could do. Stephen hung up frustrated. He was now 2 years into waiting for a tractor that was supposed to arrive in 9 months. And the machine he was running, the 2011 Case IH, was starting to show serious wear. By the fall of 2022, the Case IH needed significant repairs. The transmission finally gave out in October. The repair cost was $14,000. Stephen paid it because he didn't have a choice. He needed the tractor to finish fall field work. But he was angry. He was paying to repair a machine he had planned to trade in over a year ago. The Massey Ferguson was supposed to be here by now, but it wasn't, and no one could tell him when it would be. He called Brian again in November. Brian said the latest estimate was still early 2024. No change. Stephen asked if that was firm. Brian said nothing was firm anymore. Stephen hung up and sat in his office, staring at the calendar. It was November 2022. If the tractor arrived in early 2024, that would be 34 months from the order date, almost 3 years, and that was assuming no more delays. But the bigger problem was starting to emerge. The market was changing. Corn prices, which had been at $73 per bushel in April 2021, had dropped to $61 by November 2022. Soybeans had dropped from $16 to $13.50. Stephen's income projections for 2023 were lower than they had been in 2021. Not catastrophically lower, but lower enough that his margin was tighter. He pulled out the financing paperwork Brian had given him back in 2021. 4.1% interest, $1,900 per month. Stephen called his bank to check current rates. The loan officer told him ag equipment loans were now running between 8.5 and 9.2%. Stephen felt his chest tighten. He asked her to run the numbers on a $448,000 loan at 9% over 7 years. She called back 20 minutes later. The monthly payment would be $6,900. Stephen thought he had misheard. He asked her to repeat it. She said $6,900 per month. Stephen said that was impossible. She said that was the math. Interest rates had more than doubled since 2021. The payment had more than tripled. Stephen asked what the payment would be at 8.5%. She said $6,600. Still more than 3 times what he had budgeted for. Stephen thanked her and hung up. He sat at his desk and tried to process what he had just learned. The tractor he had ordered in 2021 with a planned payment of $1,900 per month would now cost him $6,900 per month if it arrived in 2024. That was a $4,800 per month difference, $57,600 per year. There was no way he could afford that. Stephen called Brian the next day. He explained the situation. He said the interest rate environment had completely changed, and he could no longer afford the tractor at current rates. He asked if there was any way to lock in the original rate from 2021. Brian said no. Financing terms were determined at the time of delivery, not at the time of order. The contract Stephen had signed didn't include a rate lock. It only locked in the price of the machine. Stephen asked if Massey Ferguson could do anything. Brian said he could ask, but he doubted it. Manufacturers didn't control lending rates. That was between Stephen and his bank. Stephen asked what his options were. Brian said he could cancel the order, forfeit the 20% deposit penalty, and walk away. Or he could take delivery when the tractor arrived and figure out the financing at that time. Stephen said neither of those options worked. Brian said he understood, but those were the only options available. Stephen hung up, feeling trapped. December 2022 brought more bad news. Fertilizer costs had spiked. Diesel prices were up. Input costs across the board were higher than they had been in 2021. Stephen's operating budget for 2023 was tight, very tight. He ran projections with his accountant. Even with decent yields and stable commodity prices, his profit margin for 2023 would be around $42,000. That was before accounting for any major equipment purchases. If he took delivery of the Massey Ferguson and financed it at 9%, the annual payment would be $82,800. That would put him $40,000 in the red. He couldn't do it. The math didn't work. His accountant told him he needed to cancel the order. Stephen said he would lose $9,000 in penalty fees. His accountant said losing $9,000 was better than losing $40,000 per year for 7 years. Stephen knew she was right, but he didn't want to cancel. He had been waiting for this tractor for almost 2 years. He had planned for it. He had imagined it sitting in his shed. He had test-driven it and fallen in love with the cab, the power, the technology. Canceling felt like giving up, but the numbers didn't lie. He couldn't afford it anymore. Stephen called Brian in January 2023. He said he was thinking about canceling. Brian asked him to hold off. He said Massey Ferguson had just sent an update. Production was ramping up. Deliveries were accelerating. There was a chance Stephen's tractor could arrive sooner than expected. Maybe late 2023 instead of early 2024. Brian said if Stephen could hold on a little longer, things might improve. Stephen asked if the market would improve. Brian didn't have an answer for that. Stephen said he would think about it. He hung up and decided to wait. He didn't know why. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the sunk cost of the $44,000 deposit. But he decided to wait. Spring 2023 came and went. No tractor. Commodity prices stayed flat. Interest rates stayed high. Stephen's Case IH kept running, but it was falling apart. The air conditioning failed in June. The cost to repair it was $3,200. Stephen chose not to fix it. He just ran the tractor with the windows open. It was miserable during the summer heat, but he wasn't going to spend another $3,000 on a machine he hated. He called Brian in July. He asked for an update. Brian said the tractor was in production. It was scheduled to ship in October. Delivery would likely be November or December 2023. Stephen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was finally happening. Maybe the wait was almost over. He thanked Brian and hung up. 2 weeks later, Brian called back. There was another delay, a parts shortage at the factory. The new delivery estimate was February 2024. Stephen didn't even respond. He just hung up. By the fall of 2023, Stephen had accepted that the tractor was never going to arrive at the right time. It was going to arrive in a world that no longer matched the world he had ordered it in. Commodity prices were down, interest rate, his operation was struggling, and the machine he had once wanted desperately now felt like a financial anchor he couldn't escape. He called Brian in October and asked point blank if he could walk away from the contract without penalty. Brian said no. The contract was binding. If Stephen refused delivery, the dealership could sue him for breach of contract and pursue the full balance owed. Stephen asked if anyone had ever successfully walked away. Brian said not that he knew of. The contracts were ironclad. Stephen was stuck. He either took the tractor or he fought a lawsuit. He told Brian he would take delivery. Brian said he would let him know as soon as it shipped. The Massey Ferguson 8S265 finally arrived on February 9, 2024. 34 months after Stephen had ordered it, Brian called and said it was at the dealership, ready for pickup. Stephen drove to Sioux Falls the next day. He walked into the lot and saw it sitting there, bright red, perfect paint, gleaming chrome, exactly as he had imagined it, and he felt nothing, no excitement, no pride, just dread. Brian walked him through the final paperwork. The balance due was $403,200 after accounting for the deposit. Stephen had arranged financing through his bank at 9.2%. The monthly payment was $7,100. Brian handed him the keys. Stephen climbed into the cab. It was beautiful. Everything he had wanted. The seat was comfortable. The controls were responsive. The digital display was crisp. He started the engine. It purred. He pulled out of the lot and drove it home. And the entire drive, all he could think about was the payment. $7,100 every month for 7 years. $596,400 total for a tractor that cost $448,000. He was paying $148,000 in interest alone. Stephen used the Massey Ferguson for the 2024 planting season. It performed flawlessly. The CVT was as smooth as he remembered. The GPS was precise. The cab was quiet. The tractor did everything it was supposed to do. But Stephen hated it. Every time he climbed into the cab, he thought about the payment. Every time he finished a field, he calculated how much that field needed to yield just to cover the cost of the machine. The math was brutal. At $7,100 per month, the tractor cost $85,200 per year. Stephen's average annual profit before the tractor had been around $53,000. The Massey Ferguson was costing him more than his entire profit margin. He was farming at a loss, and he would be farming at a loss for 7 years unless something changed. By June, Stephen made a decision. He couldn't keep the tractor. The payment was killing him. He called 3 different dealerships and asked what they would give him for a trade. The highest offer was $375,000. Stephen still owed $398,000 on the loan. That meant he would be $23,000 underwater if he traded it. He would have to roll that negative equity into a new loan or pay it out of pocket. Stephen didn't have $23,000 in cash, and rolling it into a new loan meant financing a machine he didn't even own anymore. He called a private sale broker and asked what the tractor was worth on the open market. The broker said maybe $390,000 if he found the right buyer. Maybe. Stephen still owed $398,000. He would have to come up with $8,000 just to break even. He listed it anyway. The listing went live in July. A 2022 Massey Ferguson 8S 265 with 320 hours. Asking price, $395,000. Stephen got 2 inquiries in the first week. Both buyers lowballed him. One offered $360,000. The other offered $355,000. Stephen declined both. He couldn't afford to take that big of a loss. He waited. No more inquiries came. He dropped the price to $385,000. Still nothing. The problem was simple. The used market for high-end tractors had collapsed. Everyone who had wanted a new tractor had already ordered one back in 2021 and 2022. Now those machines were finally being delivered, flooding the market. No one needed a slightly used tractor when they were already getting their new one. Supply had caught up with demand, and Stephen was on the wrong side of the curve. In August, Stephen got a call from a farmer in Nebraska. The guy said he was interested in the Massey Ferguson. He asked if Stephen would take $370,000. Stephen did the math in his head. He still owed $398,000. Accepting $370,000 would leave him $28,000 underwater. He would have to pay the bank $28,000 out of pocket just to sell the tractor. He didn't have it. He told the buyer no. The buyer said that was the best he could do. Stephen thanked him and hung up. He sat at his kitchen table and stared at the payment schedule. He had made 6 payments so far, $42,600, and he still owed $398,000. The tractor had depreciated $28,000 in 6 months. He was losing money faster than he was paying it off. In September, Stephen stopped making payments. He called the bank and explained the situation. He said he couldn't afford the tractor anymore. The loan officer asked if he wanted to discuss restructuring the loan. Stephen asked what that meant. She said they could extend the term to 10 years, which would lower the monthly payment. Stephen asked what the new payment would be. She said around $5,400 per month. Stephen said that still didn't work. She asked if he was planning to default. Stephen said he didn't know. She said if he defaulted, the bank would repossess the tractor, sell it at auction, and pursue him for the deficiency balance. Stephen asked what that would look like. She said the tractor would probably sell for around $340,000 at auction. He would owe the difference between that and the remaining loan balance, plus fees and interest, probably around $70,000. Stephen said he didn't have $70,000. She said the bank could garnish his farm income or place a lien on his property. Stephen hung up. He felt sick. He hired a lawyer in October. The lawyer reviewed the contract with the dealership and the loan agreement with the bank. He said Stephen had very few options. The dealership contract was binding. The loan was secured by the tractor. If Stephen stopped paying, the bank would take the tractor and come after him for the shortfall. The lawyer asked if Stephen had any way to come up with the cash to cover the deficiency if he sold the tractor. Stephen said no. The lawyer said his best option was to try to negotiate a settlement with the bank, offer them a lump sum to forgive part of the debt. Stephen asked how much that would take. The lawyer said probably $50,000. Stephen didn't have that either. The lawyer said then Stephen needed to keep making payments and hope the market improved. Stephen said the market wasn't going to improve. The lawyer said then Stephen was in a very difficult position. In November, Stephen received a default notice from the bank. He had missed 2 payments. The notice said if he didn't bring the account current within 30 days, the bank would initiate repossession proceedings. Stephen called the loan officer and begged for more time. She said the bank had given him more time. He needed to pay or they would take action. Stephen asked if they could work out a payment plan. She said they already had a payment plan. It was called the loan agreement. Stephen hung up. He knew what was coming. The repo truck arrived on December 18, 2024. 2 men with a flatbed trailer. They had a court order. Stephen watched from his porch as they loaded the Massey Ferguson onto the trailer. The tractor had 470 hours on it, less than a year of use. It still looked brand new. The men strapped it down and drove away. Stephen stood there in the cold and felt nothing. The tractor was gone, but the debt wasn't. 3 weeks later, he got a letter from the bank. The tractor had sold at auction for $332,000. Stephen still owed $389,000 on the loan. The deficiency balance was $57,000. The bank demanded payment within 60 days or they would pursue legal action. Stephen didn't have $57,000. He negotiated a payment plan, $3,000 per month for 19 months. He would be paying for a tractor he no longer owned until the summer of 2026. Stephen went back to farming with the 2011 Case IH Magnum, the same tractor he had been planning to replace back in 2021. It was old, it was loud, the cab was uncomfortable, but it was paid off, and the monthly payment was $0. He ran it through the 2025 season. It broke down twice. He fixed it both times. The repairs cost less than a single month's payment on the Massey Ferguson. In the fall of 2025, Stephen's accountant ran the numbers on his operation. After accounting for the deficiency payment plan, Stephen had netted $11,000 for the year. $11,000 for 12 months of work. It was the worst year he had ever had. And it was entirely because of a tractor he had ordered in 2021 that arrived in 2024 in a world that no longer matched the one he had planned for. The Massey Ferguson 8S.265 is operating on a farm in Iowa now. A different owner bought it at the bank auction. He paid $332,000 for a machine that had cost Stephen $448,000. The new owner loves it. He tells people it was a great deal. Low hours, perfect condition. He doesn't know the story behind it. He doesn't know that the previous owner lost $70,000 on it and spent a year making payments on a machine he didn't own anymore. The tractor doesn't carry that history. Only Stephen carries it, and he will carry it until the summer of 2026 when the final payment clears. $3,000 per month. 19 months, $57,000. For a tractor that arrived 3 years late into a market that had collapsed, with financing terms that tripled, leaving him with a machine he couldn't afford and a debt he couldn't escape. The order was placed in April 2021. The tractor arrived in February 2024, and by the time it got there, everything had changed, except the contract. The contract stayed the same, and Stephen paid the price.